I would like to open with a caveat. I am a historian of Imperial Russia. In my training and research, I have always sought to approach these historical regions through the lens of empire, with all of the complex entanglements that this brings. And I am very aware, because of my interest in empire, of the importance of incorporating both Russian and non-Russian primary sources into my work in order to avoid simply duplicating the imperial gaze from the center. But from this perspective, I am very critical of the paper that I am presenting today as being very much a work in progress. The sources that I currently draw upon are primarily Russian language discourses from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And this is because my previous research was primarily in Russian language archives centered in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kazan, and Tbilisi. And I've had to postpone several planned research trips to Kiev, first because of the happy event of the birth of my son in 2018, then the much more challenging impact of the pandemic, and now, of course, by the ongoing war. And for this reason, I'm very excited to learn, particularly from my Ukrainian colleagues, about the sources available to researchers in Kiev, particularly archival materials that might be of use to me as I continue to develop this project, which, as I note, is very much a work in process. So, okay. So in 1903, Father Mikhail Lisitsyn wrote a scathing review of the quality of contemporary sacred chant in Kyiv for the Russian language periodical Contemporary Theater and Music, which he gave the eye-catching title, The Decline of Kyiv-Pechersk Chant. And in his article, Lisitsyn lamented the danger in which the tradition of the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra was in. He called this tradition, as you see here, one of the most important memorials to the uniqueness of Russian folk creativity. And it was, he suggested, now threatened, and I'm quoting, by complete destruction, particularly with the arrival of a new choir conductor who was uneducated, and who, in Lisitsyn's words, was following an understanding of Lavra chant that was peasant and rude in the character of performance. And among the many sins that he ascribed to this new conductor was the expansion of the choir to a mixed choir of 45 people. He was very upset in particular about the inclusion of female voices in the choir, which he said were replacing the original Lavra chant with, quote, compositions of an Italian character of the 18th and early 19th century that have outlived their era, end quote. Moreover, lamented Lisitsyn, instead of calling forth justified critique from the elders of the monastery, who should themselves desire the preservation of the ancient chant, the conductor had been given free rein to simply destroy these ancient traditions. And so, in place of this blatant disregard of the treasures of Russian folk creativity, Lisitsyn called for the, quote, simple but good transcription of chant that does not change the essence of the harmonic style formed over the centuries, end quote. And just, as an additional bonus, he said they should replace the conductor who was with someone who would be more sensitive to Russian national tradition. Now, Lisitsyn's view actually held considerable weight. In addition to his work as a priest, Lisitsyn was a composer, music historian, and actually a censor for the Sacred Music Press, and he was instrumental in conceptualizing the main features in what came to be known as the new direction in Russian Orthodox music, which included a trend towards the, quotes, the purification of what were perceived to be ancient Russian chants through the stripping away of Western-style harmonic alterations that had crept in over the centuries and threatened this innate purity. Born in Smolensk province, Lisitsyn had attended the local theological seminary before studying music theory at Mili Balakarov's Free Music School in St. Petersburg. And in 1893, Lisitsyn actually entered the Kiev Theological Academy, where he also directed the choir. So he's someone with a lot of influence in this area. After he completed his dissertation in theology in 1897, so he's an expert in theology as well as church music, he moved to St. Petersburg, where he was active as a composer and censor, promoting the aesthetic ideals of the new direction in Russian church music. And it's in this status that he is speaking in this article about the decline of Kyiv-Pechersk chant. And for this reason, his critique drew considerable attention. And in fact, it sparked a very lively and often not very polite debate within the pages of the Russian language Russian musical newspaper. And a certain VP, he only writes with his initials, responded with a vehement defense of the quality, style, and age of chant in the Lavra, and argued that what Lisitsyn framed as the decline of musical quality was, in fact, a marker of the unique singing tradition of the Lavra that had formed over many centuries. And furthermore, BP insisted that both the foundational chant melodies and their so-called harmonization in the partiesny style, which was something else that Lisitsyn critiqued, was not a sign of Western pollution, which is often how the new direction framed these things, but an honest expression of regional identity that was distinct from Muscovite tradition. And VP's critical reply in turn sparked an ongoing debate. There's more letters from Lisitsyn that get published, and then VP publishes some more things. There is a priest at the Lavra who actually also sends a letter weighing in on this, so that ultimately, in an attempt to actually clarify the reality of what was going on the ground, Nikolai Kompanevsky, who is another activist in the New Direction School of Russian Church Music, actually took an excursion to Kiev. And he reported back in a quite lengthy article on the soundscapes that he discovered there through his own research, both in the Lavra and in the city of Kiev more generally. And Kompanevsky ultimately offers sort of a mixed view situation. He concluded that Kievan chant had indeed declined in recent years, but that the natural musical talent of the local population of Kiev should in fact be given free rein to overcome this decline. He said, we don't need to send people in from St. Petersburg to do this. The people of Kiev themselves are extremely talented musically. They can do it themselves. But he argued that the real problem was that the local clergy and monks, rather than professional musicians trained in proper music theory, and in particular the theory of Russian Orthodox music as developed by the New Direction School. So these priests have been given too much influence rather than people trained in basically the style that he himself was a representative of. Now, these debates were not just about musical purity. In many ways, they're not about music at all. What was really being contested in these conversations was the quote unquote authentic identity of Kiev itself. So some of the questions that emerge from this are, first of all, what should authentic Orthodox chant sound like in Kiev? How do you define that? Who has the right to define it? In short, and even more controversially thus, I would argue that this argument about chant and its purity was in fact an argument over the relationship of Kiev to the Russian imperial center, and in that sense, a debate over the significance of history itself. Now, well, the 1990s and 2000s witnessed a blossoming of scholarship on the once neglected field of sacred music. These narratives have tended to focus on the immediate concerns of saving sacred musical tradition from the neglect of the official atheistic Soviet era. And moreover, sacred musical traditions within the former imperial space of the empire have generally been framed in national terms. And I should note here I'm speaking specifically of English language, Russian language, and Georgian language narratives, since I have only recently achieved sufficient fluency in Ukrainian to access this scholarship, so I cannot comment on those narratives at present. But it's also understandable that this is where the scholarship was at. As churches reopened and church choirs sprang up, the immediate need was to rediscover repertoire and performance practices, right? And this took first priority. And so in Russia itself, the study of sacred musical tradition often simply celebrated the new direction in Orthodox music as this great example of Russian national tradition and the purification of foreign accretions and the establishment of a harmonic style and compositional approach more respectful of the unique character of these chants. In short, as an awakening of national identity. Now, as a scholar of empire and the complexities inherent in this historical space, I am instead particularly interested in exploring the entangled nature of identities in this context. And so my larger research project that I'm talking about today draws on the study of the sacred chant revival movements of the late 19th, early 20th century across the Russian Empire as a lens through which to examine the contestation between multiple overlapping identities that emerged in these spaces. And indeed, I find that the so-called peripheries of empire, I find that also a problematic term, but it is currently the term we use, were themselves essential to the construction of both imperial Russian and national Russian identities, as well as the regional, local, and national conceptions of self that emerged in opposition to the imperial center. So my analysis in the larger project accordingly is very much framed as a story of empire. It begins in Kazan, where the future founder of the new direction in Russian church music, Stepan Smolensky, you saw a picture of right here, actually began his career as the choir conductor at the Missionary School for Baptized Tatars, where his work was adapting Orthodox chant for the Tatar language. After this start, he moves to Moscow, becomes incredibly influential, and this brings us to the Moscow aspect. But I also use a case study approach to explore how debates in the relationship over sacred chant and local, regional, and national identities played out in Tbilisi, in particular. There's a very strong sacred chant revival movement in the late 19th century, and in Kiev, which is what I'm going to talk about today. And so my goal in this project is to highlight the centrality of non-ethnic Russian, particularly Ukrainian and Georgian identities, in shaping the emergence of a new conception of musical orthodoxy by the early 20th century that was itself uncomfortably entangled with growing debates about national identities and difference. And the reason I chose to focus on religious chant in particular, rather than folk music, is first of all, folk music tends to have a more immediate assumed link to a particular ethnic or national group. We could problematize that and discuss it, but there is this assumption. Orthodox music, though, there's an additional claim about it, which is that it has a universal aspect, right? Because it's really about correct worship, and it's not about local, regional, national identities. And this is one of the narratives that you actually see often coming out in these debates. Okay, so let's turn back to the debate over the existing soundscape of the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra in the early 20th century. And as we heard from our previous speaker, this location is actually central, of course, to the history of Orthodoxy in the region. And one of the things that I noted in doing my research is that, first of all, there is general agreement amongst all of the primary sources that links the differences in chant tradition. So first of all, everyone recognizes that there's something different here. And they all link it to the unique historical context of southwestern Russia. I have this in quotes. This is the term that is used in the printed sources in Imperial Russia at this point in time. Indeed, the distinctive history and its impact on shaping the character of the people of this region is not questioned by a single source that I've looked at. Even those that are very critical will acknowledge this as a reality explaining what is happening in Kiev at this time. Second, I would also note that narratives about the decline of a once pure sacred tradition are themselves common parlance in the late 19th, early 20th century. We see this actually in every chant revival movement. We also see this in chant revival movements outside of the Russian Empire as well. So this narrative in itself is really not surprising. What's more interesting is, I think, getting into the question of how purity and deviation from an imagined purity is actually defined. And in the case of the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra, the language maps quite easily onto broader discussions about the historical place of Ukraine and Ukrainians within the Russian Empire. And so just in brief, the Russian language debates from the late 19th, early 20th century over this topic, the ones that I've looked at from periodical press, from memoir accounts, letters, this sort of thing, can be divided into three competing conclusions that people offer. The first of these is that the stylistic differences that are noted highlight the emergence of a distinctive identity in Kiev. Sometimes people will talk about this as Little Russian. Again, this is not surprising given that the sources I look at are published sources in late Imperial Russia where you will not see the term Ukrainian. I do suspect that there are other sources that if I can dig into local archives more might actually use this term. The second argument that you find is that similarities in chant tradition highlight that Kievan chant is a local or a regional deviation of an imagined norm, which is associated with the imperial center, which is the idea that, pure tradition exists in Moscow. This is a deviation from that. But, this second argument says, well, it adds regional color and it's kind of, increasing the vibrancy of Orthodox culture writ large across the empire, right? And then the third argument that you also find is that stylistic differences in Kievan chant are a deviation from true Orthodox and true Russian practice. Notice how these two things become intertwined and should, for that reason, be eradicated. So if we look at these briefly in a little bit more detail, we can unpack this a bit more. So my examples here for the first narrative are drawn from the 1895 book by Voznesenskiy about Southwest Rus, according to the manuscript sources that he looked at. This scholar actually did quite what he claimed at the time was a definitive study of the manuscripts that were available to him from the region, dating from pre-1654, which is an important turning date, the 1650s to 1675, and then 1675 to early 1799. And then he compared these sources with the standardized publications issued by the Holy Synod in Moscow beginning in 1772. So to try to map out what is comparable and what changes. So Voznesenskiy concludes that there are clear differences between practice in the imperial center and in southwestern Rus, both in the style of singing and in the setting of the chant melody. Right? Chants in Kiev tend towards less elaborate melismas and ceremonial practices. They use more regular rhythmic patterns and a more straightforward singing presentation. However, he insists that these chants, and I have the quote up here, are in no way corruptions of znamenny chant, as some have strictly suggested, notice this reference to his opponents, but are namely the chants of the Southwestern edition, or the Southwestern style, whose greater or lesser closeness to ancient Stolbovi chants in comparison with great Russian editions is still not clarified, just as the relation of Stolbovi chants in great Russian editions of 17th and 18th centuries have not been clarified. This is a really important point, and it's where it's key to read carefully some of these sources. If you step back and think about what he's arguing here, he's actually making the claim that there is no inherent reason to assume that the chants that are recorded in Kiev area are themselves not the purer form or the more original form of Orthodox chant, right? He's saying, we don't know that Great Russian chant, this is the term he uses, right? So for the imperial center, we don't know. There's no proof that those are any more pure than what we have here in Kiev. And so he goes on as well to say that the reason for the difference between the Great Russian and Southwestern singing is the church national reality of one and the other region of Russia. What does he mean by this? He makes the argument that the development of new chant melodies, the so-called Kievan style of chant, also the Bulgarian style, are themselves the outcome of the battle of orthodoxy in southwestern Rus with Catholicism and the Uniate Church. Right? And as such, he says, these are actually really important expressions of the history of this region and these people. And for all of these reasons, he argues for the continued inclusion of them in the practice, not just of the local church, but the Orthodox Church throughout Imperial Russia at this time. All right. I should say, I call this the Little Russian narrative right now, in that I'm drawing on Faith Hillis's book on Children of Rus. I find it problematic to think of quite the right term for this. On the one hand, you can see hints of what could be read as a nationalist interpretation of the distinct status of the people of Kiev as separate from the people of Muscovy. On the other hand, there's also no sense or argument for the need for any kind of political independence or separation, which kind of fits in with what Faith Hillis has argued is this idea of Little Russia as a separate, distinctive, important area, but within the boundaries of Imperial Russia. It's also hard to disentangle, though, if that is being framed this way simply because that is how you publish something in Imperial Russia, right? So the second variant, I just call this the subvariant narrative. This is sort of a more middle-of-the-ground response to Lisitsyn's complaints. So while Voznesenskiy argues for the basic equal status between Kievan and Muscovite chant traditions and populations, VP, actually, this person who responded to Lisitsyn, offers a more modest claim that frames Kievan chant as a subcategory of the znamenny chant tradition preserved in Moscow. And similarly, while he highlights the historical groundedness of partiesny style tradition as a long-term aspect of the practice, as opposed to the claim amongst New Direction scholars that it is a marker of foreign Italianate influence, VP is cautious to position this as a regional practice that is worth preserving in Kiev itself, but should not be considered important or applicable to Orthodox music in its entirety. And in a sense, I suppose one could liken this to contemporary arguments from the time that, on the one hand, emphasizes the distinctiveness of Ukrainian as a dialect of Russian, but denies it sort of an independent existence as a fully developed language. So the argument is that these chants by themselves can't stand on their own. They have importance for the local population, but are sort of regional in significance. And then the third interpretation is this rejection. This is the most extreme response to the analysis that was hinted at by Lisitsyn, which is that the chant in the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra had to be purified of its foreign Italianate influence in order for its pure Orthodox Russian character to shine through. Again, I haven't decided what the best way is to frame this narrative. Is it imperial? Is it colonial? But it is important to note that this question was widely debated in Kiev itself. And the example I have for you up on the screen here is actually a publication, Церковная, which was one of the early publications by the Old Believer population. They had a very active press, particularly in Kiev in particular. And one of the big issues that they debate in 1909 through about 1915, when the war sort of takes over their interest, is this question of chant. They're really obsessed with the question of what can we include, what can we not include. This is connected with the Old Believer rejection of the reforms of Nikon, which themselves are also associated with any chants that came into general practice after 1650. Includes anything written in Western style notation. Very critical of that. So one of these claims is that, actually the very church music books that are published by the Holy Synod are themselves not reliable. They should be purified, and all the so-called Kievan chants should themselves be removed from it because these are not actually pure representations of Orthodox identity. They are instead the argument goes, perceived as a marker of Catholic or Uniate influence, or sort of misinformed forms of Nikon. And this is one of the main arguments that you find in the Old Believer publications, although even here I should say it is not across the board. You do have more modernizing voices in the Old Believer community that also argue for the distinctiveness of the Kievan chant tradition. So I actually had a conclusion slide, which is not here. So let me see if I can find it. Preliminary conclusions, page 9. I need my page 10. Okay, so I don't have any big, huge final conclusions at this point, but I will say one of the things that becomes very clear when you dig into these historical sources is that we cannot study the sacred Orthodox chant revival in the Russian Empire without acknowledging its role, not just as a rejection of foreign Italianate influence in the framing of a national identity, but as incorporating an inherent rejection in many cases of Ukrainian distinctiveness. This is kind of baked into these debates, right? That this is actually part of the argument. So this is my first preliminary conclusion. My second would be that purely national historical narratives are incomplete on their own. Identities are relational, they are entangled, they are complex, and in other words, the place of empire is key in understanding the way that these questions were debated in the late 19th, early 20th century. And moreover, I would suggest that we still need to further conceptualize empire itself as a term. There's a lot of theorization of nationalism as something that acts on people and affects worldviews. I think there's not as much detailed work on empire and the impact that it has on the way that people perceive the world around. So I see this as a call to greater action. And then I'm also very excited to receive recommendations for other sources that I can look at. In particular, I'm interested in finding archival sources, Ukrainian language, periodicals, either historical or contemporary, recent scholarship, non-Soviet scholarship on these questions in order to expand my analysis further to capture the full range of voices. So thank you.